the knowledge, the scientific foundations about the glycemic index are possibly more solid than anything else in nutrition. And now I'm going to show you why. All right, so when we talk about glycemic index and use the abbreviation, GI, we're not talking about the gastrointestinal tract. We're talking about the glycemic index. And in particular, the glycemic index is relevant because in medicine, postprandial glycemia is a risk factor, increasingly acknowledged as a really important risk factor, not just for people with diabetes, but for people with pre-diabetes and even normal glucose levels, particularly in pregnancy. So postprandial glycemia is relevant to the prevention and management of type 2 diabetes, gestational diabetes, GDM, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and also, perhaps the evidence is less mature, but in type 1 diabetes it's relevant, in polycystic ovarian syndrome, which they now believe affects as many as 1 in 5 women, which makes it the most common endocrine disease of all, that it affects pregnancy outcomes, adverse outcomes like very large babies, and therefore child obesity, that it has applications in sport, and, interestingly, in mental performance as well, cognition. So, just about relevant to everybody on the planet. Okay, why is postprandial glycemia relevant? Well, we know from particularly research over the last 5 years, and I'm sorry you haven't got this slide, don't go looking for it because I added it at about 4 o'clock, all right? I realized that there was a gap there. I needed to tell you why high glucose levels are dangerous. You know they're dangerous for people with diabetes and pre-diabetes, but you know the high normal glucose levels are now considered to be a risk factor. So, glycemia produces insulinemia, and it goes back in the other direction. Even just physiologically raised insulin levels produce insulin resistance. And together, those two things, sometimes it's hard to separate which is the primary cause, but it produces oxidative stress in the cells. Lots of free radicals are generated. These highly reactive oxygen molecules do harm, particularly inside the mitochondria. This produces inflammatory responses, cytokines, and transcription factors that produce a whole lot of downstream effects, which are interpreted by the cell as inflammation. And this in turn affects endothelial dysfunction. So, endothelial layer of cells lining the blood vessels, these are early signs of atherosclerosis, that those blood vessels are not responding the way they should. It also affects the degree to which blood coagulation takes place, that a thrombus forms, or a thrombus forms and then dissolves, all under the influence of oxidative stress. And beta cells are the glucose sensors in the body. They're the most sensitive cells in the body, and so they should be. But if you work them really, really hard, and their mitochondria are overworked, then their mitochondria disappear, and then the beta cells themselves start to die. So, that, of course, once they start to die, you see the beginnings of type 2 diabetes. And finally, relevant to everybody, glucose is a molecule that sticks to proteins. And the higher the concentration of glucose, the more it sticks. So you all know that glycated hemoglobin is a measure of average blood glucose levels in people with diabetes. Well, glycated hemoglobin is a hemoglobin protein molecule with glucose stuck to it. All right? But every protein in the body is susceptible to this glycation process. And you know what? The proteins, once they're glycated, they're irreversible. And they don't do a good job anymore. Glycated proteins are dysfunctional themselves. And so those wrinkles everything about our body that ages is to do with advanced glycated end products, so wrinkles. All right, so let's get to carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the only food constituents that directly raise glucose levels. If I give you some olive oil to drink or I give you some fillet steak to eat, your glucose levels will stay as a flat line, okay? So foods like bread and pasta are very high in carbohydrates. But you know, the carbohydrates are not identical. If you look at them under the microscope, there are important differences. And you know, your mouth can detect those differences. You think about it. You could put a morsel of fluffy white bread in your mouth, and within 2 minutes it would sort of dissolve in your mouth because your amylase in your saliva is attacking the starch. But you put a piece of pasta in your mouth for 2 minutes. At the end of the 2 minutes, the shape of the pasta is still detectable. Spirelli pasta or penny pasta. And that's because the degree to which the starch in those foods is being broken down differs. All right, so gram for gram of carbohydrate, or if you like, weight for weight, or ounce for ounce, carbohydrates vary in their glycemic potency or glycemic impact or glycemic punch, and glycemic is just a medical word for blood glucose or blood sugar. So in layman's terms, we can say some carbohydrates are gushers because they're digested and absorbed very quickly, and they gush, the glucose gushes into the bloodstream. On the other hand, there are some carbohydrates which are digested and absorbed more slowly, and those are called trickles. And you know, in theory, you could have a carbohydrate that trickles so slowly into the bloodstream that you've got a flat line. All right, so the glycemic index is just a way of expressing these differences between carbohydrates in different foods. And it takes the foods as they're normally eaten. All right? You have to have a food that can be capable of eaten. You have to have a carbohydrate food that has sufficient amount of carbohydrate that it's called a carbohydrate food. You can't test the GI of tuna or eggs or meat or chicken, only foods that contain carbohydrate. And we're comparing them gram for gram. So it's just a tool. And when it comes to glycemic index methodology, I don't think there is anything in nutrition as well assessed or measured as the glycemic index. So just to show you why, just remember we're comparing carbohydrates gram for gram. So it's like comparing protein quality, the protein quality in chicken versus egg versus lentils. This is the same thing. We're comparing them by looking at the area under the curve over 2 hours. The area under the curve is just a nice statistical way of assessing the average glucose level across 2 hours. We express it relative to a reference food, and the reference food is usually 50 grams of glucose. But you know, it could be 25 grams of glucose, it could be 20 grams of glucose. All that matters is that there's the same amount of carbohydrate in the test food and the reference food. Because remember, you're comparing them gram for gram of carbohydrate. And because we want to standardize glycemic index testing as much as possible, we usually use 50 grams unless that's too big a load of food and we come down to 25. So the glycemic index of the reference food by definition is 100, and to assess the glycemic response of any one test food, be it a new bread or a new breakfast cereal, we need at least 10 subjects. All right? So in our lab, because we've tested the reference food 3 times on 3 separate occasions in every single individual, and we do that once a month so that we've got a running average of their glucose tolerance status, and because we test the food once and we test it over 2 hours and we take 8 blood samples and we do them in duplicate, we've actually got 640 data points to generate the glycemic index of one food. Pretty amazing, isn't it? All right? And then they talk about the measurement of fibre. You know, if I measure the fiber content of the food or even the carbohydrate content of the food, I don't know it as precisely as that because the methodologies vary. All right, so some examples. I'm sure you know this stuff. Potatoes have a very high glycemic index in most instances, but people are working really hard. The agricultural industry is working really hard to come up with some low GI varieties. In my books, everything was once low GI. Nature's packaging produces low GI carbohydrates. And what we've done over the course of time and studies on breeding is produce higher and higher GI foods. So white bread, but also wholemeal bread, because the particle size is the same, the rate of digestion is just the same. Most rices, like especially jasmine rice, has a GI as high as a glucose load, about 100. It's sticky rice. Most breakfast cereals, even the whole grain breakfast cereal, because they've been processed, they've been cooked in lots of water, lots of hydration takes place. They then get rolled and they get flaked and they get puffed and they get toasted. Is it any surprise that at the end of all that, the carbohydrate's really easy digested and absorbed, even if the fiber's there, with a few exceptions? And of course, most low-fat snacks that the food industry has provided willingly at the demand of the medical profession. You know, most low-fat snacks are puffed and popped and you name it, and so of course they're easy to digest and absorb. On the other hand, on the right, your right, we've got those that are considered low GI, just for convenience, for the help of, you know, just to help people. We have to draw the line somewhere. So pasta and noodles, most shapes, cooked normally, not cooked for an hour, not sloppy, not canned spaghetti, but normal spaghetti, normal pasta and noodles usually have a lowish GI. Legumes always around the 40 mark. Even when canned, lentils and things are still low GI. Dairy products are usually low GI, even when they're sweetened, like ice cream and yogurt. And of course, most fruit and vegetables, with a few exceptions which really don't matter when it comes to the fruits, but it do matter in the case of potatoes. So potatoes is an important exception to that rule. Some rices like basmati and some other rices that are produced in India, which have a sort of dry texture, they're not sticky. You can actually see this difference. And some breads, in Australia we know the GI of most of the breads, and there are breads on the market that have a GI of 45, 40, and people like them and buy them in large amounts because they're nice breads. But they're denser and they have a coarser texture and they're made by more traditional old-fashioned methods. And some breakfast cereals. So Kellogg's in Australia produces a product called Guardian, which is for your heart. I don't know whether you have it here. And it's got psyllium fibre added, which is a viscous fibre. And viscous fibre, I'm going to come back to later, helps to slow down the rate at which digestion takes place. All right, so one of the most important take-home messages today is that sugary foods are not the demons when it comes to the glycemic index of foods. All right, starchy foods, modern starchy foods in general have a higher glycemic index because they're more rapidly digested and absorbed than the sugary foods. So, all right, so glycemic potency of carbohydrate is a property of the food, not of the person. Does that make sense? It's a property of the food. So people can be variable, but the food's not variable. We've got a given food. So the glycemic potency depends on the extent to which that food is emptied from the stomach, the speed of digestion of that food and its carbohydrate, and the speed of absorption of that food, the breakdown products of starch digestion or sugar digestion. So all these things are influenced to a huge extent by the gelatinization of the starch. Is that a term you're familiar with? Gelatinized starch? Okay, these they're light microscopy photographs of starch molecules, starting off with the raw starch granules, which are like little grains of sand. And when you you add enough water and enough heat, they begin to hydrate, and the starch moves from inside the granule to the watery solution, and the ghosts are left behind, the ghosts of the starch granule. And if you keep cooking and there's enough water, then all the starch becomes solubilized and really easy to digest and absorb. And what's happening is that the food industry now produces most of our foods in this fourth panel, whereas originally there were more foods like this in the second panel. In fact, pasta is here, and lentils and soybeans and all the legumes, chickpeas are in this one. So really, the gelatinization of starch is in the hands of the food industry, and therefore the glycemic index is in the hands of the food industry. All right, so how relevant is the glycemic index? You're using the area under the curve, and that's a method of averaging. What about the glucose spike? Some studies suggest it's the actual height of the spike which produces the harm in people with diabetes. And what we did in this study that was published last year is take all foods that we'd tested. 1,126 foods were in our database. We tested them all in 50-gram carbohydrate portions, all in 10 different people. And so each dot is the glycemic index of one food, all right, measured in 10 people. And what you can see there is that as the glycemic index increases, the peak plasma glucose increases in a way that is predictable. And if you've got a glycemic index of 40, then the peak glucose is only 6 millimolar, which is 6 times 20, 120 milligrams. Whereas if you've got a glycemic index of 80, then the peak glucose is about 8. All right? And some people say that a person with diabetes should never have a glucose level higher than 8. Okay. All right. So what about people with type 1 diabetes? This is a study that actually comes from Australia by dietitians, Diabetes Care 2008, and this is continuous glucose monitoring, and that takes a blood glucose in the interstitial fluid every 5 minutes, I think, every
5 seconds, then it averages out, and you get a data point every 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, so if you heard that, it's pretty frequent. So this is the difference between a high GI meal. It was just bread and some sort of glucose solution. And this is a low GI meal, which was a low GI bread on our market. And it was white bread, by the way. It had a viscous fibre added, and so it's on the market, and it's marketed especially at kids. And you can see the difference there is this peak rise is 6 millimolar here and about 3 millimolar here. It's a really big difference which predicts complications. And if you use the continuous glucose monitor and it generates the average glucose over time, then you can see over 24 hours, these 20 children, the average glucose level is significantly different and important in terms of their complications. All right, what about glycemic load? Everybody says to me, you know, what about glycemic load, Jenny? Isn't it more relevant than glycemic index? Well, yes and no, and I'll talk more about it as we go along. So the glycemic index is a ranking of the glycemic potential of carbohydrates per unit of carbohydrate. Glycemic load is the glycemic potential per serving of food. So all we've done to generate glycemic load is multiply the glycemic index as a percentage, so over 100, times the grams of carbohydrate per serving. So let me show you some examples. A GI of an apple is 40, so glycemic load, its glycemic load is 40% times 15, because there's 15 grams approximately in one apple, and you've got 6 grams of glycemic load. So think of glycemic load as the grams of carbohydrate adjusted for its glycemic potential. Does that make sense? Adjusted? So think of it as a measure of carbohydrate, only a measure of its glycemic potential of that carbohydrate. So the glycemic load of one slice of bread is 70% times 15, which gives you 11. So you can generate the glycemic load of the whole diet in an individual, and in most Western countries, you know, some people, you know, might have as low as 60 and other people might have as high as 180. All right, in their self-selected diets, there's a threefold difference from one person to the next. All right? And one of the questions the nutritional epidemiologists have is that difference in glycemic load predicting who gets diabetes or who has a heart attack? So I'll show you some of those slides later. All right, glycemic load is a mathematical concept. All right, it's a multiplication. So how well does it actually reflect metabolic responses? Well, this paper we've just sent off about a week ago to Diabetes Care. So what we showed, we had 120 single foods that we tested in 1,000 kilojoule portions in 10 people each, all right? So each dot is, again, the average of 10 people. And this is the observed glucose response relative to 1,000 kilojoule portion of pure glucose. So what you can see is glycemic load is a stronger predictor, 0.87, R's 0.87, compared to available carbohydrate. So if you want to know the metabolic response, the glycemic response, use glycemic load, not grams of carbohydrate. What about protein and fat and fiber? Here we've got the same 120 foods, and here on the x-axis is protein in that 1,000 kilojoule portion, so it varied from 0 up to 60 or so grams of protein. And what you can see is that, well, you know, there's an inverse relationship. There's the higher the protein content, the lower the glycemic response. But, you know, the R is not as strong. It's about 0.5. And fiber. Fiber's the real surprise. These are 120 typical foods. In fact, they're the top 120 foods, the top 120 sources of carbohydrate in the American diet, because the Harvard told us which 120 foods to test. And as you can see, there's no relationship with fiber. Total fiber, cereal fiber, fruit and vegetable fiber, you name it, there's no relationship. All right, glycemic load is also a really good predictor of insulinemia. So this is one of the questions about the glycemic index. Does it predict insulin responses? And the answer is yes. So the multiplication of carbohydrate times glycemic index is your best predictor of postprandial insulinemia. All right, so the next part of my presentation is all about the glycemic index and its use as a clinical tool. So what I've been doing there is just proving that it does do what we think it does, that it does predict the glucose response to single foods, and in other studies we've shown it predicts the glucose response to mixed meals. So it's been shown to improve glucose control in diabetes, it's been shown to improve insulin sensitivity, it's been shown to be associated with reduced risk of type 2 diabetes and reduced risk of CVD, and some evidence that I'll show you shortly, it seems to improve weight control. So this is the first study, and I've picked the studies that are published in the best journals, the highest impact journals, with the largest number of subjects. So here we've got 210 subjects studied over 24 weeks. It's one of David Jenkins' studies published at the end of 2008, and he compared it with the best practice ADA, American Diabetes Association, high fiber diet. All right, it is high fiber. It's got brown everything. They called it the brown diet. So it was brown pasta, brown bread, brown rice. Okay, so it's best practice at the moment. And yet we still saw a better HbA1c reduction in those that were following the low GI diet. So this one might have had a tiny little bit more fiber, but not enough to make a difference. And they didn't get told you have to eat brown everything. You know, it was a much more palatable diet for most people. I meant to say too, they also found that was a greater reduction in the use of medications in the low GI group. They also showed a rise in HDL cholesterol in the low GI group compared to a fall in HDL cholesterol in the conventional diet group. This is a meta-analysis. Are you used to looking at forest plots? Forest plots, do they mean something to you? Aeroplane graphs, some people call them. So this is a way of averaging good studies that have been done. Some may not show a statistical difference by themselves, but maybe if you pool all the data, there's a more powerful statistical model there. And interestingly, you can also look at whether the effect is sort of heterogeneous. Is it, inconsistent? So if it falls on one side of this line, 0, then that's telling you that the effect is really consistent. And that's what you find here with these studies. So these are studies that met the criteria. This is in the Cochrane Library, which is the best you can get basically in terms of clinical evidence. And you can see that compared to the best practice ADA diet, a low GI diet produces another an incremental fall in HbA1c equivalent to 0.5 percentage point. And that's clinically important. All right. Perhaps one of the reasons why low GI diets improve HbA1c is because they improve insulin sensitivity. So this is 12 type 2 subjects, 12-week crossover study, and they maintained their weight throughout. So it's not about weight loss, and weight loss we know already improves insulin sensitivity. And this is the best gold standard method of measuring insulin sensitivity. It's the euglycemic hyperinsulinemic clamp. And so this tells you that on a low GI diet, people can deal with a glucose load or a carbohydrate challenge much more easily. They can metabolically deal with it much more easily. We've just finished this study and published it. It's in this month's issue of American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. It was a really hard study to carry out because women with polycystic ovarian syndrome are a really hard group to study. They find it difficult to lose weight, much more difficult than the average person, much more difficult than even people with type 2 diabetes. And they had to lose 7% of their body weight or be trying for at least 12 months to lose that weight before they finished our study. And a lot of them never got to 7% on either diet. But by the 12-month point, we did the final tests. And this is the change of insulin sensitivity. The improvement in insulin sensitivity was higher in the low GI diet than the high fiber diet, the conventional healthy diet. And that's even though they lost an equal amount of weight. So that's what our endpoint was. They had to lose a certain amount of weight, and then we did the final tests. So weight loss differences don't explain that difference in insulin sensitivity. So, and this slide to me is one of the best reasons why we should be recommending a low glycemic index diet for everyone, because this is a meta-analysis. It's published, a meta-analysis of all the studies that have been done looking at the correlation between risk of type 2 diabetes in prospective studies and the glycemic index of their diet. They all favour the low GI diet. We selected only the studies that had validated their carbohydrate content. They'd validated and showed that their method of measuring carbohydrate intake was the same by 2 different dietary history methods. So when you do it that way, it's really consistent. Are you used to looking at data like this in quintiles and relative risk? Yes. So when we look at quintiles, we're dividing a population up into 5 groups. And in this case, we're dividing them up into 5 groups according to their glycemic load of their diet. So we've analysed their diet at baseline. We've divided them up into 5 groups. This group has the lowest glycemic load. This group, quintile 5, has the highest glycemic load. And this is their relative risk for gestational diabetes. So this is the Harvard Nurses' Health Study. It looks at the 13,000 women that got pregnant during the study over 8 years of follow-up, and it's looking at who had gestational diabetes and who didn't. Okay? And what you see is that in quintile 5 of glycemic load, there were 60% more cases of GDM, and that difference was significant after multivariate analysis, so adjusting for differences in fiber content or differences in family history or energy or BMI, and it was still statistically significant. And it, interestingly, fat, type of fat, carbohydrate content, sugar content, none of those predicted who got gestational diabetes. All right, low GI diets also reduce the need for insulin in women who have a diagnosis of gestational diabetes. I did this study with an endocrinologist who is one of Australia's, one of the world's, for that matter, considered one of the most important, renowned experts on gestational diabetes. His name's Bob Moses, and he's on the ADA recommendations, guidelines and things, and he's on sub-editor of Diabetes Care. And you can see that they were twice as likely to need insulin if they had during the last 10 weeks of pregnancy if they were following a conventional high fiber diet. Twice as likely. And in a group of normal pregnant women, 62 healthy women were assigned to low or high GI diets at the 16th week, by the 16th week of pregnancy. So they followed either the conventional high fiber diet or they followed a low GI diet instructed by dietitians. They saw the dietitian 5 times over the course of the 2nd and 3rd trimester of pregnancy. And at the end, we looked at the number of large and small babies in each group. And this result absolutely stunned us. There are 10 times more large babies in the conventional high fiber group compared to the low GI groups. No difference in small babies, but a 10-fold difference in the number of babies above the 90th percentile. So that's roughly a baby who's weighed 4 kilograms at birth. Do you know what your birth weights are? You know your birth weights? Babies are getting bigger and bigger, in case you didn't know, and that's partly because women are going into pregnancy at a higher BMI and they're gaining more weight during pregnancy. But one of the most established facts in pregnancy is that the mother's blood glucose level is directly correlated with the baby's weight. That's why they treat women with gestational diabetes so carefully, because the high birth weight baby is a risk factor for a very unpleasant delivery, emergency cesareans, shoulder dystocia, preeclampsia, you name it. Also, the big baby above 4 kilograms has a much higher risk of childhood obesity. So in my books, my hunch is that our childhood obesity epidemic has a great deal to do with the fact that mothers' blood glucose levels are getting higher and higher. Partly to do with their weight, but partly to do with the fact that our diet is so high GI. All right, so coming back to some more epidemiology, this is the Nurses' Health Study, 20 years of follow-up, 82,000 women. It doesn't get much better than this. And they divided the women, the population, up into deciles of glycemic load. So deciles is dividing them up into groups of 10 groups. So this group here has the lowest glycemic load, this group here has the highest glycemic load, and then they look at the number of cases of cardiovascular disease in each of those 10 groups. Okay, and in this case, the cardiovascular disease was actually heart attack, all right? Heart attack. And you've got an almost 2-fold risk of having a heart attack if you're in the highest decile of glycemic load. And that's after highly significant, and it's more significant than fat or type of fat or sugar or starch. It's glycemic load. And what I wanted you to notice, I said before that I think, glycemic load is not as important as glycemic index. I think glycemic index is simpler for the public. And one of the reasons is that what you can see here is those first deciles, first 5 deciles, there's no difference in their relative risk. All right? It's only starting to increase around this point here in the middle. So people don't need to aim for the lowest glycemic load possible. The lowest glycemic load possible is an Atkins diet. So if you tell people to follow a low glycemic load diet, you run the risk that they look up tables and they find that bacon and cream and cheese and everything else has a glycemic load of 0. All right? You're giving them a permission, basically, to follow a diet which is probably going to give them a heart attack. All right. Glycemic load, this is a very recent study, 2010. It was March. It's a very large cohort, 32,000 women from Italy. And they've divided them up into quartiles of glycemic load and 8 years of follow-up. And the reason I show it to you is because this group did something the Harvard group haven't done. They actually analysed the glycemic index of the foods in Italy. They didn't guess. Americans are often guessing the glycemic index of their foods because they haven't got someone testing for them most of the time. So they guess and they extrapolate and they impute, and it's probably not bad, but this is more precise. And you can see there's a 2.2-fold increased risk of cardiovascular disease in the highest quartile of glycemic load. All right, I'm getting towards the end if you're getting tired. What about weight control? And this is what preoccupies most people most of the time. It's the rate of weight loss, and it's also about prevention of weight regain. And I'll just make a point of saying that most of the obesity experts have now acknowledged that, rate of weight loss is not the best gauge of the best diet. Rate of weight loss, people can lose weight very quickly, but they might put it back on very quickly because they've lost a lot of their lean body tissue, their muscle mass. And the rate of weight loss might have more to do with motivation and basically anyone can lose weight on any diet, all right? The challenge is to prevent weight regain, weight loss maintenance. And that's where the research has shifted and where we need the best, longest studies to look at weight regain. And I'm going to show you one of them shortly. Okay, this is one of David Ludwig's study. Kara Eberling is a dietitian, and she leads most of these studies. And they looked at 18 months, so it's nice and long. There was 6 months first of active weight loss, followed by 12 months of just weight maintenance. And they saw the dietitian very frequently. They randomized them to 2 sorts of diets. One was a low glycemic load diet, but it's not an Atkins diet. It's a low glycemic index diet. It has a little bit more protein and a little bit more fat than a normal diet, but very, it's still a very typical and palatable diet. And this is the low-fat, conventional low-fat diet. They both had the same protein content. And what you can see is if you look at all 73 subjects, there's no significant difference between the 2 diets. No, not in the rate of weight loss or in weight maintenance. But they had a hypothesis right at the beginning of the study that it was those subjects who had at baseline a very high 30-minute insulin response during a glucose tolerance test. They said that those people were the ones that would probably benefit most from lowering the glycemic load of their diet. Does that make sense? Because not because they were probably more insulin resistant, but because they were capable of secreting high amounts of insulin. all right? So we can't just conclude that these are the most insulin resistant. They're the ones with enough beta cell function to be able to produce a very high insulin response. And there you can see that the difference is really stark, that on the low glycemic, low diet, they lost weight really fast, and they much faster, and that they maintained that weight loss over 12 months. That's a pretty fabulous result. And it also, perhaps, it resolves some of the controversy that perhaps some people are more prone or more likely to benefit from a low glycemic index or low glycemic, low diet than others. Okay, this is my final study, I promise. This is the Diogenes study, and I'm hoping next week it's presented at the International Congress of Obesity in Stockholm. These findings were presented, these are preliminary findings, and they were presented at the European Association for the Study of Diabetes meeting last September, and they were on their website of the EASD. They're still there, and I took a screenshot, okay? And this is what they did in this study. It is the most expensive nutrition weight loss study ever done. It cost 16 million euros, and it's in 6 euros is about twice, I think. 1.5. Yeah.
Yeah, it's about 1.4.
1.4, so about 20 million US dollars. I'm thinking in Aussie dollars. So 800 people, 800 families actually, where one or other parent, or one or both parents had obesity, and they had 8 different cities and a whole army of dietitians, okay, who saw them frequently. And what they did was they lost weight on OptiFast. They had to lose 8% of their body weight. Then they were randomized at this point here, after they reached the 8% body weight loss, and then they were randomized to one of 5 diets. And this diet here, this sort of magenta cerise, that is a combination of higher protein and lower GI. They actually lost weight during the weight maintenance stage. These 2 diets here, the 2 purple ones, are both low GI diets. This one here is a high protein diet with normal carbs, that sort of greeny fluorescent one. This black line is your conventional healthy diet in that particular country, so they gained weight. And this one here is what they called a low protein, but it wasn't low protein, it's about 17% protein and high GI carbs. And you can see their stark differences. What's more, this group here that were given the high protein, low GI instructions, they had the lowest dropout rate. The lowest dropout rate of all the diets. So the people actually knew that this diet was good for them, they wanted to follow it, and they had the best outcomes. All right.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Quick question to clarify that. The high protein, low GI is not the Atkins diet then?
No. Yeah, I'll make that clear, sorry. It's 25% of energy is protein. 23% of energy of protein, it's not really high. They couldn't get it as high as they actually wanted it. So, many people are probably eating 22% of energy as protein naturally. So it's a very ordinary high protein diet, not Atkins. All the diets have the same fat content. They're all 30% of energy. They've got the same type of fat. So they're really just asking the question, does a high protein diet help? Yes, it helps. Does a low GI diet help? Yes. And if you combine the 2 together, then you've got some sort of synergism, or at least additive effect. Okay. Now, the reason I'm here is because the manufacturers of PGX commissioned our laboratory in Sydney to do some studies on this very novel viscous functional fibre. Its novelty is the fact that it doesn't turn into a viscous, slippery, slimy mass immediately. Guar gum does that, all right? And guar gum is really viscous. Guar gum really lowers glycemia, but it's so unpalatable and so difficult to deal with that the food industry has given up on guar gum. This gum, this viscous fibre, has delayed development of viscosity. So when you eat it, it doesn't become claggy and awful sticky in your mouth. You can sprinkle it on your food, and that's what we did in this first study. We gave them a breakfast meal with different amounts of the PGX granules. They were sprinkled on the meal from memory, 2.5, 5 grams or 7.5 grams, and you can see that it's not coming out very well, but that's with the placebo, that's with 2.5 grams, that's with 5, and that's with 7.5 grams. And to get that effect, you're actually reducing glycemia by about 50%. That's the area under the curve. So if you wanted to use psyllium or fibre or something like that, you'd have to have 15 grams of psyllium. And we also showed that the capsules had a second meal effect. So if you took 2, 4, 6, 8 capsules with your evening meal and then had a standard breakfast the next morning, then you got a reduction in glycemia, and that's called the second meal effect. You got a reduction in glycemia at breakfast. So you're improving people's glucose tolerance, perhaps because there are things going on in the colon, in the large bowel, that are producing free fatty acids that are improving insulin sensitivity. So in Australia, we have a symbol program where we're trying to make sure that people use the glycemic index in a rational, healthy way. The company that was formed to do that is called the Glycemic Index Foundation. It's a not-for-profit organisation. It's got 3 partners: the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation Australia, University of Sydney, and Diabetes Australia. And in a partnership founded in 2001, and we did this because consumers were asking, the food industry was asking. We endorse healthy, low GI foods. That symbol goes on healthy, low GI foods. And by healthy, I mean they must meet, in addition to low GI, they must meet strict nutritional criteria, which are category specific. So they must have fibre, they must, if they're a cereal product, they must have low sodium, they must have low saturated fat. We're trying to make sure that the message is balanced, all right? So, final slide. Modern starchy foods have a high GI. That's one of my take-home messages. High glucose levels are dangerous. Even high glucose levels within the normal range. All right? They're called normal, but they're really only normal for our modern food supply. They're not normal for a hunter-gatherer diet. They're not normal for the first farmers. Low GI diets reduce postprandial glycemia. Low GI diets improve diabetes control, as well as improving risk factors for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And finally, there are implications for weight loss and weight loss maintenance. So I hope you agree with me. I've just given you a run around the lake, a very superficial speedboat ride around the lake. There are hundreds of studies that show that the glycemic index works. Not all of them are consistent. Not all of them have a positive effect, but they often favour the low GI diet without being statistically significant because the study is underpowered. It hasn't got enough subjects to show a significant difference. Okay, I have a duality of interest. I do all this GI testing, but it's with the University of Sydney. It's doing it. I just happen to direct it. I'm the president of that Glycemic Index Foundation, and I'm the co-author of these books, which surprised everyone, I can tell you, because we imagined that these books had a very, very narrow audience. And finally, we've been commissioned to do this research for the manufacturers of PGX. If you would like some useful resources, I can recommend some good books. Sorry. So this is the 4th edition. It's in your book. This is the New Glucose Revolution. We call this the mother book. It's coming out on the 13th of July. I went to the bookshop here, Chapters, and said, can I please buy a book called the Low GI Handbook? And they looked it up and said, can't sell it to you till the 13th, but this lady has published a lot of books. And he sent me to the diet and nutrition section. So this, and I found this book in the shelves there too. So thank you very much. You've been very attentive.